Sir, my mom said you would know what to do with this. The little girl's voice was barely louder than the gentle music drifting beneath the crystal chandeliers, yet somehow every word seemed to cut through the polished laughter filling the grand ballroom. Jonathan Reed paused with one hand resting on the stem of a sparkling water glass as executives, investors, and city officials continued exchanging practiced smiles beneath the golden lights of the annual Reed Foundation Gala. The room shimmered with elegance, black tuxedos, evening gowns, polished marble floors reflecting the glow of enormous chandeliers, but none of it held his attention anymore. Standing just a few feet away was a little black girl, no older than 8, wearing a faded blue coat carefully buttoned despite one missing button near the collar. Her neatly braided hair framed a face that carried far more courage than someone her age should ever have needed. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't crying. She wasn't asking for anything. She simply held out a weathered cream-colored envelope with both hands as though it were the most valuable thing she had ever owned. Security noticed her almost instantly. One guard stepped forward politely, lowering his voice. "Sweetheart, this is a private event." Before he could finish, the girl looked up at Jonathan instead. "Please," she said quietly. "Just take it." Jonathan studied the envelope. There was no company logo. No return address. Only his name written across the front in careful handwriting that looked strangely familiar despite the faded ink. For reasons he couldn't explain, he accepted it. The girl's shoulders relaxed ever so slightly, as though she had completed an important promise. Around them, conversations resumed. Someone laughed near the orchestra. Glasses clinked together. A photographer called several guests toward the backdrop. Yet Jonathan remained perfectly still, staring at the envelope resting in his hands. It felt unexpectedly heavy for a few sheets of paper. "Who gave you this?" he asked. The little girl smiled with quiet politeness. "My mom." Jonathan nodded slowly. "Where is she now?" Her eyes drifted toward one of the tall ballroom windows where the city lights shimmered against the cool autumn sky. "She couldn't come," she answered gently. "She asked me to come instead." There was no bitterness in her voice. No attempt to earn sympathy. Only simple honesty delivered with remarkable grace. Jonathan wanted to ask another question, but she had already taken one careful step backward. "Wait," he called. "What's your name?" "Naomi Brooks," she replied. "Thank you for reading every page." Before he could respond, she turned and quietly disappeared through the crowd, weaving between tables decorated with white roses until the revolving doors swallowed her small figure into the evening. Jonathan remained frozen, the orchestra fading into distant noise. Slowly he slipped one finger beneath the old envelope's seal. Inside rested several folded pages tied together with a thin blue ribbon that had clearly been retied many times over the years. A single dried pressed daisy fell gently onto the polished marble floor. He bent to pick it up, and as he unfolded the first page, his heartbeat slowed. The opening sentence was ordinary enough to make him almost smile. The second made him frown. But when he reached the third page, every trace of color quietly drained from his face, and for the first time in more than 20 years, Jonathan Reed realized that the life he believed he remembered had been missing its most important chapter all along. Jonathan Reed stood motionless while the sounds of the gala faded into an indistinct hum around him. Conversations continued, silverware chimed softly against fine china, and a string quartet carried on with a familiar melody, but none of it seemed to reach him anymore. His eyes remained fixed on the third page resting between his hands. The handwriting was unmistakably graceful, each letter formed with patient care, and although more than 2 decades had passed, memory quietly supplied the name before he even reached the signature. Eleanor. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting out a slow breath that he had not realized he had been holding. The last time he had seen that handwriting, either of them had owned much more than hope. They had been young, convinced that every promise made beneath a summer sky would somehow survive the years ahead. Life, however, had chosen a different path. Jonathan had accepted an opportunity hundreds of miles away, believing success could always make up for time. He never wrote again after his first few unanswered letters, assuming Eleanor had moved on just as he believed he had. Yet the pages in his hands told an entirely different story. They were not filled with blame. They carried no bitterness, no demands, and no request for money. Instead, every sentence spoke with remarkable kindness. Eleanor described watching Jonathan's career from a distance, celebrating every achievement without expecting him to remember the girl who once believed in his impossible dreams. She wrote about teaching her daughter that generosity mattered more than wealth and that keeping a promise, even one made long ago, revealed a person's true character. Jonathan swallowed hard as his eyes reached the final line on the page. If Naomi ever finds you, please do not feel guilty. Simply finish reading before deciding what kind of man you still wish to become. He lowered the paper slowly, stunned not by accusation but by compassion. It was easier to defend himself against anger than against forgiveness. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. His longtime assistant, Melissa Carter, approached with a concerned expression. "Jonathan, everyone is waiting for your remarks." He looked toward the stage where hundreds of guests sat expecting another speech about philanthropy, leadership, and opportunity. For the first time in years, those carefully prepared words felt strangely hollow. He folded the pages with extraordinary care, placing the blue ribbon exactly where Naomi had left it. "Melissa," he said quietly, "did security record the little girl who came inside a few minutes ago?" She nodded. "Yes, they usually archive every entrance." "Why?" Jonathan looked toward the revolving doors where Naomi had disappeared. "I need to find her." Melissa glanced at her watch. "Tonight?" "Especially tonight." She hesitated before giving a small nod. "I will ask the security office." As she walked away, Jonathan reached into the envelope once more, convinced he had already seen everything inside. His fingertips brushed against something firm hidden beneath the folded pages. Carefully, he turned the envelope upside down. A small photograph slipped into his palm. The colors had faded with time, but the image remained clear enough to steal the breath from his lungs. It showed a much younger Jonathan sitting on the hood of an old pickup truck beside Eleanor during a county fair, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Across the back, written in the same elegant handwriting, were only 7 simple words. "You promised we would always finish together." Jonathan Reed slipped the photograph back inside the envelope as though even the slightest careless movement might damage the fragile connection it carried across 20 years. Around him the gala continued with polished perfection, yet the celebration no longer belonged to him. He quietly stepped away from the ballroom before anyone noticed the change in his expression. Melissa caught up with him near the security office carrying a digital tablet. "We found her," she said softly. "She left through the front entrance about 6 minutes ago. She was alone." Jonathan looked at the security footage. Naomi walked across the marble lobby with calm, unhurried steps, her faded blue coat buttoned neatly against the cool evening air. She never looked back toward the ballroom. She never hesitated, as though she had already completed the only reason she came. "Can we zoom in?" Jonathan asked. Melissa enlarged the image. Naomi paused outside the revolving doors for only a second before speaking to the elderly doorman. The man smiled warmly and pointed toward the bus stop across the street. Jonathan noticed something that made his chest tighten. Naomi carefully reached into her pocket and counted a few coins before boarding the city bus. Nothing about her suggested desperation. Everything about her reflected dignity. "Which route is that?" he asked. Melissa checked another screen. "Route 23. It heads toward the east side." Jonathan picked up his coat without another word. "Cancel my speech." Melissa blinked in surprise. "Jonathan, there are almost 400 guests waiting." He offered a faint smile that carried more honesty than confidence. "They will survive one missed speech. I am afraid I might not survive missing this little girl." 20 minutes later his car rolled quietly through streets where the bright lights of downtown slowly gave way to older neighborhoods filled with brick apartment buildings, family diners, and small corner stores preparing to close for the evening. The driver followed the city bus from a respectful distance until Naomi stepped off near a modest public library. Jonathan remained inside the car, unwilling to frighten her. He watched as she crossed the sidewalk, stopped beside a bronze memorial bench, and gently removed a folded piece of notebook paper from her pocket. She smiled at it before placing it carefully inside a library book return slot. Curious, Jonathan waited until she disappeared around the corner before walking over. The return slot contained only one worn children's novel and the folded paper resting neatly inside its front cover. He hesitated, remembering the trust Naomi had already placed in him, then unfolded the note. It was written in careful handwriting much like the letter from Eleanor. "Dear Mom, I gave him the envelope just like you asked." He looked surprised, but he was kind. "I think he read all the pages because he looked at the picture for a long time. I hope you would be proud of both of us. I am going to keep believing that people can remember the good they almost forgot." Jonathan lowered the note slowly, his vision blurring as the cool autumn breeze rustled the leaves above him. Eleanor had not simply raised a thoughtful daughter. She had raised a child who believed hope could quietly change a heart without asking for anything in return. As Jonathan gently returned the note to the book, he noticed a small library card tucked inside the back cover. It listed only one emergency contact. The name printed there caused him to stop breathing for just a moment. Grace Brooks. The address beneath it was only 3 blocks away. Jonathan Reed stood on the quiet sidewalk for several long moments, the library card still resting gently between his fingers. The city had settled into the peaceful rhythm of late evening. A distant train horn echoed across the neighborhood, porch lights glowed warmly through lace curtains, and children laughed somewhere beyond the rows of maple trees before their voices slowly disappeared indoors. It was a world completely different from the polished ballroom he had left behind less than an hour earlier, yet somehow it felt far more genuine. He slipped the library card back into the book exactly where Naomi had placed it. Every small action she had taken carried the same careful respect. She never assumed anything belonged to her that did not. She left everything exactly as she had found it. Jonathan walked the 3 short blocks in silence until he reached a modest white house with a narrow front porch and flower boxes filled with late autumn mums. The paint had faded over the years, but the home was tidy, peaceful, and clearly loved. A small wind chime swayed gently above the porch steps, filling the evening air with soft notes that reminded him of summers he had almost forgotten. He hesitated before knocking. After a few seconds, the front door opened slowly. An elderly black woman with silver hair and kind eyes looked at him with quiet curiosity. She wore a simple knitted sweater and held a dish towel folded neatly across one arm. Before Jonathan could introduce himself, she smiled softly, almost as though she had expected him all along. "You finally finished reading it," she said. Jonathan blinked in surprise. "You know who I am?" The woman nodded. "Eleanor showed me enough photographs that I would recognize you anywhere." Jonathan lowered his eyes for a moment. "You must be Grace Brooks." "I am." She stepped aside and opened the door a little wider. "Please come inside. Naomi has been hoping you would." The house smelled of cinnamon, warm bread, and old books. Family photographs lined the hallway, each frame polished with obvious care. Jonathan noticed Naomi in nearly every picture, smiling beside science fair projects, library certificates, school concerts, and community gardens. There were no expensive vacations or luxury gifts, only simple moments captured with unmistakable love. Grace noticed where his eyes had settled. "She has always believed memories are worth collecting," she said gently. Jonathan smiled faintly. "She reminds me of someone." Grace nodded knowingly. "She reminds everyone of her mother." They entered a cozy living room where a handmade quilt covered the sofa. On a nearby table rested a small wooden box tied with another faded blue ribbon identical to the one around Eleanor's letter. Jonathan looked at it without speaking. Grace carefully lifted the box into her lap. "Eleanor left this with me several years ago," she said quietly. "She told me never to mail it. Never to call you. Never to interrupt your life. She said that if the right day ever came, Naomi would know exactly when to bring the first letter." Jonathan felt his throat tighten. "Why wait so long?" Grace rested one hand gently on the wooden lid. Because Eleanor believed people should choose kindness freely. She never wanted guilt to bring you here. She wanted truth to bring you here instead. Before Jonathan could answer, light footsteps echoed from the hallway. Naomi appeared carrying 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate, her blue coat replaced by a soft yellow sweater. She smiled with the same quiet confidence she had shown at the gala and carefully placed one mug in front of Jonathan before asking only one simple question. Did you read every single page, just like you promised? Jonathan Reed looked into Naomi's hopeful eyes and answered without hesitation. Yes. Every page. A gentle smile spread across the little girl's face, not because she had been proven right, but because she had trusted that he would keep his word. Grace quietly placed the wooden box on the coffee table between them. The blue ribbon wrapped around it had faded over the years, yet it had been tied with such care that it looked almost untouched by time. Jonathan reached toward it, then stopped. Should I open it? He asked softly. Grace nodded. Eleanor wanted you to decide that for yourself. You have already taken the hardest step by coming here. Jonathan slowly untied the ribbon. Inside the box were several neatly arranged items. That seemed ordinary at first glance. There was a small pressed maple leaf, a ticket stub from a county fair, a simple silver key, and beneath them all rested another envelope marked in Eleanor's familiar handwriting. This one carried only 4 words across the front. For after you understand. Jonathan carefully unfolded the letter. Eleanor wrote that life had not followed the path either of them imagined during those hopeful summers when every dream seemed possible. She admitted there had been lonely days, difficult choices, and moments when she wondered whether Jonathan still remembered the promises they once shared beneath the old maple tree near the fairgrounds. Yet every sentence remained filled with warmth instead of regret. She explained that she never wanted Naomi to grow up believing happiness depended on someone else's success or wealth. She wanted her daughter to understand that dignity came from kindness, honesty, and keeping faith even when nobody was watching. Jonathan continued reading as silence settled comfortably around the room. Eleanor revealed that the silver key belonged to a tiny storage locker at the public library where she had volunteered for years. Inside, she wrote, Jonathan would find the final part of the story. Not because it contained money or secrets, but because every promise deserved an ending. Jonathan lowered the page, his eyes lingering on the final paragraph. I hope you never mistake success for completion. They are not the same thing. Some journeys only finish when 2 people choose forgiveness over distance. He quietly folded the letter and looked toward Grace. Why did she leave all of this instead of simply asking me to come? Grace smiled with gentle understanding. Because Eleanor believed love should never be used to pressure someone. She believed truth was strong enough to find its own way. Naomi climbed onto the armchair across from Jonathan, wrapping both hands around her mug of hot chocolate. Mom always said people remember better when they discover something themselves, she said. She told me not to explain too much. She said the letters would do that. Jonathan felt an unexpected laugh escape him, warm and quiet. She was right. Naomi tilted her head. Are you going to visit the library tomorrow? Jonathan looked down at the silver key resting in his palm. It reflected the soft light from the living room lamp like a tiny piece of unfinished history waiting patiently to be found. He closed his fingers around it with new determination. Yes, he answered. First thing in the morning? Naomi smiled again, completely satisfied, as though she had never doubted his answer for even a second. Outside, the autumn wind gently stirred the wind chime above the porch, and somewhere beyond the quiet neighborhood, the first light rain of the season began to fall, washing away the last traces of a past that had finally begun to find its way home. The next morning arrived beneath a pale gray sky that left the streets glistening from the gentle rain that had fallen overnight. Jonathan Reed stood outside the neighborhood library before the doors unlocked, the small silver key resting securely in his coat pocket. For years his mornings had begun with board meetings, financial reports, and schedules planned down to the minute. Today none of those things mattered. At exactly 9 o'clock the front doors opened, and an elderly librarian greeted him with a warm smile that suggested she had already heard his name many times before. "You must be Mr. Reed," she said kindly. Jonathan looked surprised. "You were expecting me?" The librarian nodded. "Eleanor believed you would come one day. She never guessed when, but she always believed you would." She led him through rows of well-worn books until they reached a quiet hallway where several small storage lockers lined one wall. Jonathan removed the silver key with careful hands. The tiny metal lock clicked open on the first try, revealing a narrow compartment no larger than a shoebox. Inside rested a simple canvas journal, a neatly folded quilt square stitched with blue thread, and a sealed envelope addressed in Naomi's handwriting instead of Eleanor's. Jonathan reached for the journal first. The opening pages contained volunteer schedules, reading lists, and notes about children's programs Eleanor had organized over the years. As he continued turning the pages, he realized it had slowly transformed into something much more personal. Eleanor had documented small acts of kindness that she witnessed every week. A teenager helping an elderly neighbor carry groceries. A firefighter reading stories to children after school. A cashier quietly paying for someone's bread without asking for recognition. Beside every story she had written the same sentence in blue ink. Kindness grows best when nobody expects applause. Jonathan closed the journal for a moment, deeply moved by how carefully she had collected hope instead of disappointment. He unfolded the quilt square next. Sewn into one corner were dozens of tiny signatures from children who had attended Eleanor's reading circle through the years. Naomi's name appeared among them in careful block letters, surrounded by colorful embroidered stars. The final envelope remained unopened. Jonathan hesitated before breaking the seal. Inside was a short letter written by Naomi only a few weeks earlier. "Dear Mr. Reed, if you are reading this, it means you kept every promise the letters asked you to keep. Mom said people do not become family because they share the same house. They become family because they choose to keep showing up. I do not need presents. Grandma and I already have enough. I only hope you will keep visiting after all the letters are finished because I would rather have stories than surprises." Jonathan quietly lowered the page, feeling the weight of those simple words settle gently over his heart. There was no request for money, no list of dreams that depended on his wealth. Only an invitation to become part of ordinary moments that could never be purchased. As he carefully placed everything back into the locker, the librarian handed him one final item that had been resting behind the journal. It was a library checkout card with only one blank line remaining beneath dozens of completed entries. Eleanor had written a single note across the bottom. "The last story has not been borrowed yet. It is waiting for the person willing to help write it." Jonathan Reed left the library carrying nothing except the canvas journal and the checkout card. Yet he felt as though he had been entrusted with something far more valuable than any business contract he had ever signed. Instead of returning to his downtown office, he asked his driver to take him back to Grace Brooks's neighborhood. Along the way he watched parents walking children home from school, neighbors greeting one another from front porches, and volunteers arranging boxes of donated food outside a community center. For years he had driven past places like these without truly seeing them. Today every ordinary moment reminded him of the pages Eleanor had filled with quiet acts of kindness that never appeared in newspapers or annual reports. When he arrived, Naomi was sitting on the front porch with a stack of library books balanced beside her. She looked up with a bright smile that carried no surprise at all. "You found the locker," she said. Jonathan smiled back. "I did." Naomi carefully closed the book she had been reading. "Did you find the last letter?" "I found much more than that." Grace stepped outside carrying a small basket filled with fresh blueberry muffins. "Perfect timing," she said warmly. "The neighborhood reading hour starts in 15 minutes. Jonathan looked at her with curiosity. "Reading hour?" Grace nodded toward the community center across the street where children were slowly gathering with backpacks and picture books tucked beneath their arms. "Every Thursday. Eleanor started it years ago. After she was gone, everyone decided it should continue." Jonathan glanced toward Naomi. "Do you go every week?" She laughed softly. I have not missed one yet. They crossed the street together beneath the shade of tall oak trees whose golden leaves drifted lazily across the sidewalk. Inside the community room, colorful paper stars hung from the ceiling while shelves overflowed with donated books that had clearly been read and loved many times over. The children welcomed Naomi immediately, waving as though she were the oldest friend in the room. Jonathan quietly stood near the back, uncertain whether he belonged there. Before he could slip away unnoticed, Naomi walked to the front carrying a well-worn copy of Charlotte's Web. She turned toward him with complete confidence. "Would you read today?" she asked. Jonathan blinked. "Me?" Naomi nodded. "Mom always said stories sound different when someone reads them with their whole heart." The room grew peacefully quiet. Dozens of young faces turned toward him, waiting with patient expectation rather than pressure. Jonathan accepted the book, took a slow breath, and began reading the opening page. At first his voice carried the polished rhythm of someone accustomed to boardrooms and presentations. Gradually it softened. The words slowed. The characters came alive. Children smiled, laughed gently, and leaned closer as the story unfolded. When he finally looked up after several chapters, he noticed Naomi watching him with quiet satisfaction. She was not impressed because a billionaire had read a book. She was simply happy that someone had chosen to stay. As the children gathered their things to leave, one little boy tugged gently on Jonathan's sleeve and asked, "Are you coming back next Thursday?" Jonathan looked across the room at Naomi and Grace before answering with complete certainty. "Yes," he said. "I believe I have another story to finish." The following Thursday arrived with bright autumn sunshine stretching across the neighborhood, and for the first time in many years Jonathan Reed canceled every afternoon meeting without asking anyone's permission. His executive team stared in disbelief as he closed his calendar and placed the canvas journal on his desk instead of another financial report. Before leaving his office, he gathered several department leaders in the conference room. They expected a discussion about quarterly investments or international expansion. Instead, Jonathan placed Eleanor's journal in the center of the polished table. "I spent years measuring success by numbers," he said calmly. "I would like us to begin measuring it by the lives we help strengthen." The room fell completely silent. He spoke about community libraries, neighborhood reading programs, and opportunities that quietly changed children's futures long before they ever appeared on a resume. He never mentioned Eleanor's name. He never spoke about the letters or the promises that had brought him there. Those memories belonged to someone else. What he shared instead was a simple decision. The Reed Foundation would establish a nationwide initiative to restore local libraries, support volunteer reading circles, and provide books to neighborhoods where families needed them most. One executive finally asked, "How much should we allocate for the first year?" Jonathan smiled gently. "Enough so that no child ever has to wonder whether stories belong to them." That afternoon he returned to the community center carrying several large boxes filled with carefully selected books. Naomi noticed him before anyone else. She ran over, not to inspect the boxes, but simply to welcome him back. "You came," she said happily. Jonathan laughed softly. "I told you I would." Together they unpacked dozens of novels, picture books, science guides, history collections, and classic American stories. The children surrounded the growing shelves with wide eyes, carefully choosing which book they wanted to borrow first. One little girl hugged a book about space exploration as though she had discovered treasure. A young boy excitedly opened an encyclopedia of animals, immediately pointing out facts he wanted to read aloud. Jonathan watched every smile with quiet gratitude. None of it felt like charity. It felt like possibility. Later that afternoon, Grace joined him on the front porch while Naomi helped younger children organize the new shelves inside. Grace looked across the street before speaking. "She would have loved this." Jonathan nodded slowly. "I wish she could have seen it." Grace smiled kindly. "Perhaps she already has, just not in the way we usually imagine." Jonathan remained silent for a long moment before reaching into his coat pocket. He carefully removed the worn library checkout card Eleanor had left behind. Only one blank line remained beneath decades of borrowed stories. He borrowed a pen from Grace and slowly wrote his own name on the final line before adding the date beside it. Grace noticed the emotion in his eyes but said nothing. She simply placed one hand gently over his for a brief moment. Across the street, Naomi stepped outside, carrying a stack of books almost as tall as she was. She noticed the card in Jonathan's hand and smiled with quiet understanding. "Now the last story belongs to you," she said. Jonathan looked at the little girl whose kindness had changed the direction of his life, then folded the checkout card carefully and slipped it back into his wallet, knowing that the final story had never been about borrowing a book at all. It had always been about learning how to keep showing up. 1 year passed with the quiet certainty of changing seasons, and every Thursday afternoon the community reading room filled with familiar laughter, turning pages, and the warm voices of neighbors who had become family without ever planning to. The shelves, once half empty, now stretched from one wall to the other, overflowing with donated books from every corner of the country. Libraries supported by the Reed Foundation had opened new reading programs in dozens of towns, but Jonathan Reed still protected one tradition above every public celebration and every newspaper headline. No matter where business called him, Thursday belonged to Naomi, Grace, and the children. On the anniversary of the day Naomi first walked into the gala carrying the weathered envelope, the community gathered outside beneath the same tall oak trees where golden leaves drifted gently across the sidewalk. A small bronze plaque had been placed beside the entrance to the reading room. It bore only a simple inscription: "In honor of Eleanor Brooks, who believed every story could help someone find their way home." Jonathan stood quietly before the plaque while Grace rested one hand upon his shoulder. "She would tell you not to stand here too long," Grace said with a smile. "She always believed stories should be lived more than remembered." Jonathan smiled through grateful eyes. "She is still teaching me." The afternoon unfolded with shared books, homemade desserts, children's songs, and neighbors exchanging stories about the people who had quietly changed their lives through simple acts of kindness. Nothing about the gathering was extravagant. There were folding chairs instead of grand stages, paper cups instead of crystal glasses, and cheerful conversations instead of formal speeches. Yet Jonathan had never attended a celebration that felt richer. As the sun began to settle behind the trees, Naomi walked toward him carrying a familiar cream-colored envelope tied with another faded blue ribbon. She had grown a little taller over the past year, but the same calm confidence still shined in her eyes. She held the envelope out with both hands, just as she had the first night they met. Jonathan accepted it gently and looked at her with quiet curiosity. "Another letter?" Naomi nodded. "This one is from me." He untied the ribbon and unfolded the single page inside. The handwriting was careful, steady, and unmistakably her own. "Dear Jonathan, Mom always believed that some people spend their whole lives searching for treasure without realizing they can become someone else's treasure instead. I used to think I was delivering her final letter. Now I understand I was delivering her first gift. Thank you for reading every page. Thank you for coming back. Thank you for proving that promises can grow stronger with time instead of weaker. I hope that one day I can help someone the way you helped me, not with money, but by showing up when it matters most." Jonathan lowered the letter slowly, unable to speak for several moments. Then he looked at Naomi and smiled with the quiet peace of a man who had finally reached the destination he never knew he had been searching for. "Your mother was right," he said softly. "The most important stories are never the ones we inherit. They are the ones we choose to continue." Naomi slipped her small hand into his, and together they walked toward the reading room where children waited with open books and eager smiles. The wind stirred the oak leaves overhead, carrying with it the gentle sound of turning pages, and somewhere within that peaceful afternoon, one forgotten promise had become a living legacy that would continue writing new chapters long after every letter had been read.